HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Goodness Paradox, the strange relationship between peace and violence in human evolution, by Richard Wrangham, read by Michael Page. Preface. At the start of my career, I would have been surprised to learn that 50 years later I would be publishing a book about humans. In the 1970s, I was privileged to be a graduate student working in Jane Goodall's research project on chimpanzees in Tanzania. Spending whole days trailing individual apes in a natural habitat was a joy. All that I wanted to do was study animal behavior, and in 1987 I launched my own study of wild chimpanzees in Uganda's Kibale National Park. My bucolic research was disturbed, however, by discoveries that were too intriguing to ignore. Chimpanzees exhibited occasional episodes of exceptional violence. To shed an evolutionary light on this behavior, I compared chimpanzees with their sister species, bonobos. In the 1990s, research on bonobos was beginning in earnest. Chimpanzees and bonobos were proving to be an extraordinary duo, bonobos being much more peaceful than the relatively aggressive chimpanzees. In various collaborations that I describe in this book, but most particularly with Brian Hare and Victoria Wobber, my colleagues and I concluded that bonobos had diverged from a chimpanzee-like ancestor by a process that was strongly akin to domestication. We call the process self-domestication. And since human behavior has often been considered similar to the behavior of domesticated animals, the insights from bonobos suggested lessons for human evolution. The key fact about humans is that within our social communities we have a low propensity to fight. Compared to most wild mammals, we are very tolerant. I was acutely aware, however, that even if humans are in some ways notably unreactive, in other ways we are a very aggressive species. In 1996, in a book called Demonic Males, Apes and the Origins of Human Violence, Dale Peterson and I described evolutionary explanations for similarities in aggression between chimpanzees and humans. The pervasiveness of violence in human society is inescapable, and the evolutionary theories explaining it seem sound. So how could our domesticated qualities and our capacity for terrible violence be reconciled? For the next 20 years or so, I grappled with this question. The resolution that I describe in this book is that our social tolerance and our aggressiveness are not the opposites that at first they appear to be, because the two behaviors involve different types of aggression. Our social tolerance comes from our having a relatively low tendency for reactive aggression, whereas the violence that makes humans deadly is proactive aggression. The story of how our species came to combine these different tendencies, low reactive aggression and high proactive aggression, has not been told before. It takes us into many corners of anthropology, biology, and psychology, and will undoubtedly continue to be developed. But I believe that it already offers a rich and fresh perspective on the evolution of our behavioral and moral tendencies, as well as on the fascinating question of how and why our species, Homo sapiens, came into existence at all. Much of the material in this book is so new that it has been published only in scientific papers. My goal here is to make this richly technical literature and its far-reaching implications more accessible. I approach the topic through the eyes of a chimpanzee watcher who has walked, watched, and listened in many habitats of East and Central Africa. Those of us privileged to have spent days alone with apes have felt touched by Pleistocene breezes. The romance of the past, the story of our ancestors, is a thrill, and innumerable mysteries remain for future generations seeking the origins of the modern mind in deep time. Enlarged understanding of our prehistory and of who we are will not be the only reward. Dreams inspired by the African air can yet generate a stronger and more secure view of ourselves, if we open our minds to worlds beyond those that we know well. Introduction. Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. Adolf Hitler, who ordered the execution of some 8 million people and was responsible for the deaths of many millions more, was said by his secretary Traudl Junge to have had an agreeable, friendly, and paternal manner. He hated cruelty to animals. He was a vegetarian, adored his dog Blondie, and was inconsolable when Blondie died. Pol Pot, the leader of Cambodia, whose policies killed maybe a quarter of his country's people, was known to his acquaintances as a soft-spoken and kindly teacher of French history. During 18 months in prison, Joseph Stalin was always amazingly calm and never shouted or swore. In effect, he was a model gentleman inmate, not obviously the kind of person who would later annihilate millions for political convenience. Because seriously evil men can have a gentle side, we hesitate to empathize with their kindness for fear of seeming to rationalize or excuse their crimes. Such men remind us, however, of a curious fact about our species. We are not merely the most intelligent of animals, we also have a rare and perplexing combination of moral tendencies. We can be the nastiest of species and also the nicest. In 1958, the playwright and songwriter Noel Coward captured the strangeness of this duality. He had lived through the Second World War, and the bad side of human nature was fully obvious to him. "It is hard to imagine," he wrote, "considering the inherent silliness, cruelty, and superstition of the human race, how it has contrived to last as long as it has. The witch-hunting, the torturing, the gullibility, the massacres, the intolerance, the wild futility of human behavior over the centuries is hardly credible. And yet most of the time we do wonderful things that are the very opposite of silliness, cruelty, and superstition, depending as they do on reason, kindness, and cooperation. The technological and cultural marvels that distinguish our species are made possible by these qualities, in combination with our intelligence. Coward's examples still resonate. Hearts can be withdrawn from human breasts, dead hearts, and after a little neat manipulation popped back again as good as new. The skies can be conquered. Sputniks can whiz round and round the globe and be controlled and guided. And My Fair Lady opened in London last night. Heart surgery, space travel, and comic opera all depend on advances that would have amazed our distant ancestors. More important from an evolutionary point of view, however, they also depend on capacities for a quite exceptional ability to work together, including tolerance, trust, and understanding. Those are some of the qualities that cause our species to be thought of as exceptionally good. In short, a great oddity about humanity is our moral range, from unspeakable viciousness to heartbreaking generosity. From a biological perspective, such diversity presents an unsolved problem. If we evolved to be good, why are we also so vile? Or if we evolved to be wicked, how come we can also be so benign? The combination of human good and evil is not a product of modernity. To judge from the behavior of recent hunter-gatherers and the records of archaeology, for hundreds of thousands of years people have shared food, divided their labor, and helped the needy. Our Pleistocene ancestors were in many ways thoroughly tolerant and peaceful. Yet the same sources of evidence also indicate that our forebears practiced raiding, sexual dominance, torture, and executions with varieties of cruelty that were as abominable as any Nazi practice. Certainly nowadays a capacity for great cruelty and violence is not particular to any one group. For a variety of reasons, a given society might have experienced exceptional peace for decades, even as another might have suffered spasms of exceptional violence. But this does not suggest any differences in the innate psychology of people throughout time and world over. Everywhere humans seem to have had the same propensity for both virtue and violence. Babies show a similar contradiction in their tendencies. Before infants can talk, they will smile and chuckle and sometimes help a friendly adult in need, an extraordinary demonstration of our innate predisposition to trust one another. At other times, however, those same big-hearted offspring will scream and rage with sublime self-centeredness to get their way. There are two classic explanations for this paradoxical combination of selflessness and selfishness. Both assume that our social behavior is hugely determined by our biology. Both also agree that only one of our two notable tendencies is the product of genetic evolution. They differ, however, in which side of our personality each regards as fundamental, our docility or our aggressiveness. One explanation posits that tolerance and docility are innate to humanity. According to this view, although we are essentially good, our corruptibility stands in the way of our living in perpetual peace. Some religious thinkers blame supernatural forces such as the devil or original sin for this state of affairs. Secular thinkers, by contrast, might choose instead to imagine evil as engendered by societal forces such as patriarchy, imperialism, or inequality. Either way, it is assumed that we are born good but are susceptible to corruption. The other explanation claims that it is our bad side that is innate. We are born selfish and competitive, and we would continue in the same vein were it not for efforts at self-improvement informed by civilizing forces, which might include enjoinments from parents, philosophers, priests, and teachers, or the lessons of history. For centuries, people have simplified their understanding of a confusing world by adopting one or the other of these opposed views. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes are classic icons for the alternatives. Rousseau has come to stand for humanity's being instinctively nice, Hobbes for humanity's being naturally wicked. Both positions have some merit. There is plenty of evidence that humans have innate tendencies for kindness, just as there is for our having spontaneously selfish feelings that can lead to aggression. No one has found a way to say that one kind of tendency is more biologically meaningful or evolutionarily influential than the other. The intrusion of politics makes the debate all the harder to settle, because when these abstractly theoretical analyses become arguments with societal significance, both sides tend to harden their stance. If you are a Rousseauian, your belief in essential human goodness probably marks you out as a peace-loving, easy-going crusader for social justice with faith in the masses. If you are a Hobbesian, your cynical view of human motives suggests you need a need for social control, cherishing hierarchy and accepting the inevitability of war. The debate becomes less about biology or psychology and more about social causes, political structures, and the moral high ground. Prospects for simple resolution duly recede. I believe that there is an escape from this morass about the fundamental nature of humans. Rather than needing to prove that either side is wrong, we should ask whether the debate makes sense at all. Babies point us in the right direction. The Rousseau and Hobbes perspectives were both right as far as they went. We are naturally good in the way that Rousseau is said to have claimed, and we are naturally selfish, much as Hobbes argued. The potential for good and evil occurs in every individual. Our biology determines the contradictory aspects of our personalities, and society modifies both tendencies. Our goodness can be intensified or corrupted, just as our selfishness can be exaggerated or reduced. Once we acknowledge that we are at once innately good and innately bad, the sterile old argument gives way to fascinating new problems. If Rousseauians and Hobbesians are both partly right, then what is the source of our strange combination of behavioral tendencies? We know from the study of other species, particularly birds and mammals, that natural selection can favor a wide range of inclinations. Some species are relatively uncompetitive, some relatively aggressive, some both, some neither. The combination that makes humans odd is that we are both intensely calm in our normal social interactions, and yet in some circumstances so aggressive that we readily kill. How did this come to be? Evolutionary biologists follow a principle crisply stated by the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky in a 1973 address to the National Association of Biology Teachers. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. How evolutionary theory is best used, however, is a subject of debate. A key question for this book is, what is the significance of primate behavior? A traditional view holds that animal and human mentality differ so widely that primates are irrelevant for the science of human nature. Thomas Henry Huxley was the first evolutionary biologist to challenge that position. In 1863, he argued that apes provide rich clues to the origins of human behavior and cognition. I have endeavored to show that no absolute structural line of demarcation can be drawn between the animal world and ourselves. Huxley anticipated his opponent's objections. On all sides I shall hear the cry, "The power of knowledge, the conscience of good and evil, the pitiful tenderness of human affections raise us out of all real fellowship with the brutes." That kind of skepticism is understandable and has not completely disappeared. In 2003, the evolutionary biologist David Barash argued, "It is highly questionable whether human beings carry a significant primate legacy at all when it comes to behavior." There are also variations of behavior galore due to culture. One society is peaceful, another violent. One reckons clan membership down the female line, one down the male line. Some have strict rules about sexual behavior, while others are lax. The diversity can seem so overwhelming as to render uniformity irrelevant for comparison with other species. After a detailed survey of hunter-gatherer behavior, the anthropologist Robert Kelly abandoned the notion that human behavior can be characterized as having any particular form. There is no original human society, no basal human adaptation, he wrote in 1995. Universal behaviors never existed. In short, the idea that human behavior is so infinitely variable that our species has no special features in common with non-human primates is understandable. Two strong arguments stand against it, however. On the one hand, human variation is limited. We rarely do have characteristic forms of society. Nowhere do people live in troops as baboons do, or in isolated harems like gorillas, or in entirely promiscuous communities like chimpanzees or bonobos. Human societies consist of families within groups that are part of larger communities, an arrangement that is characteristic of our species and distinctive from other species. Yet, on the other hand, in many ways humans and primates rarely do behave alike. The evolutionist Charles Darwin early on observed similarities in the expressions of emotion in humans and other animals, such as the bristling of the hair under the influence of extreme terror, or uncovering of the teeth under the influence of extreme rage. This community of certain expressions, he wrote, is rendered somewhat more intelligible if we believe in their descent from a common ancestor. The fact that we share smiles and frowns with our cousin primates is intriguing, but even that observation seems relatively trivial compared with the discoveries about chimpanzee and bonobo behavior that began in the 1960s and continue to accumulate. Chimpanzees and bonobos are the two ape species most closely and equally related to humans. They present an astonishing pair. They look so similar to each other that they were not recognized to be separate species for years after both were known. Each of the two sister species shares extensive behavioral similarities to humans, yet they are in many ways social opposites. Among chimpanzees, males are dominant over females, and they are relatively violent. Among bonobos, females are often dominant over males. Violence is muted, and eroticism is a frequent substitute for aggression. The behavioral distinctions between the two eerily echo competing social stances in the modern human world. The divergence of male and female interests, for example, or between hierarchy, competition, and power on the one hand, and egalitarianism, tolerance, and negotiated settlement on the other. The two species conjure such different visions of the essential ape that their opposition has become something of a battleground in primatology, each supposed by different schools to represent our ancestral lineage better than the other. As we will hear, the notion that either chimpanzees or bonobos, but not both, point to human behavioral origins is not very helpful. A more intriguing goal is to understand why the two species are similar to humans in their different ways. Their behavioral contrasts are of a piece with the central question animating this book. Why are humans both highly tolerant, like bonobos, and highly violent, like chimpanzees? Chapter 1 launches the investigation by documenting behavioral differences among humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos. Decades of research suggest how species differences in aggression can evolve. Aggressiveness was once thought of as a tendency running from low to high along one dimension. But we now recognize that aggression comes in not one but two major forms, each with its own biological underpinnings and its own evolutionary story. As I show in Chapter 2, humans are positively dualistic with respect to aggression. We are low on the scale of one type, reactive aggression, and high on the other, proactive aggression. Reactive aggression is the hot type, such as losing one's temper and lashing out. Proactive aggression is cold, planned, and deliberate. So our core question becomes two. Why are we so lacking in reactive aggressiveness and yet so highly proficient at proactive aggressiveness? The answer to the first explains our virtue. The answer to the second accounts for our violence. Our low tendency for reactive aggression gives us our relative docility and tolerance. Tolerance is a rare phenomenon in wild animals, at least in the extreme form that humans show. It is found, however, among domesticated species. In Chapter 3, I consider the similarities between domesticated animals and humans and show why an increasing number of scientists believe that humans should be regarded as a domesticated version of an earlier human ancestor. One of the exciting aspects of the biology of domesticated animals is that researchers are beginning to understand puzzling similarities that occur among many unrelated species. Why, for example, do cats, dogs, and horses frequently sport white patches of hair, unlike their wild ancestors? Chapter 4 explains new theories linking the evolution of physical features such as these to changes in behavior. Humans exhibit enough such features to justify calling us a domesticated species. That conclusion, which was first intimated more than 200 years ago, creates a problem. If humans are like a domesticated species, how did we get that way? Who could have domesticated us? Bonobos suggest a solution. In Chapter 5, I review the evidence that bonobos, like humans, show many of the features of a domesticated species. Obviously, bonobos were not domesticated by humans. The process happened in nature, unaffected by human beings. Bonobos must have self-domesticated. That evolutionary transformation seems likely to be widespread among wild species. If so, there would be nothing exceptional in the self-domestication of human ancestors. In Chapter 6, I therefore trace the evidence that Homo sapiens have had a domestication syndrome since their origin, about 300,000 years ago. Surprisingly few attempts have been made to explain why Homo sapiens arose. And, as I describe, even the most recent paleoanthropological scenarios have not addressed the important problem of why selection should have favored a relatively tolerant, docile species with a low tendency for reactive aggression. How self-domestication happened is in general an open question, with different answers expected for different species. Clues come from the way that aggressive individuals are prevented from dominating others. Among bonobos, aggressive males are suppressed mainly by the joint action of cooperating females. Probably, therefore, bonobo self-domestication was initiated by females being able to punish bullying males. In small-scale societies of humans, females do not control males to the same extent as they do among bonobos. Instead, among humans, the ultimate solution to stopping male aggressors is execution by adult males. In Chapters 7 and 8, I describe the use of execution in human society to force domineering men to conform to egalitarian norms, and I explain why I believe self-domestication through the selective force of execution was responsible for reducing humans' reactive aggression from the beginnings of Homo sapiens. If genetic selection against reactive aggression indeed occurred through self-domestication, we should expect human behavior to share aspects of the behavior of domesticated animals beyond reduced aggression. In Chapter 9, I examine this proposition. I emphasize that the proper comparison is not between humans and apes, because too many evolutionary changes have occurred in the 7 million years or so since we had a common ancestor. Instead, the proper comparison is between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, whom I take as a stand-in for our pre-sapiens ancestors. Chapter 9 reviews evidence that Homo sapiens had a more highly elaborated culture than Neanderthals. The difference, I propose, is plausibly due to Homo sapiens' having lost more of the aggressiveness of the common ancestor than Neanderthals did. A low propensity for reactive aggression enhances the capacity for tolerant cooperation, but it is not the only contributor to human social virtue. Morality is also vital. Chapter 10 asks why our evolved moral sensibilities often make people afraid of being criticized. Sensitivity to criticism, I conclude, would have promoted evolutionary success thanks to the emergence of the same new social feature that was responsible for self-domestication, a coalition able to carry out executions at will. Our ancestors' moral senses helped protect them from being killed for the crime of nonconformity. The ability of adults, and particularly men, to conspire in the act of capital punishment is part of a larger system of social control using proactive aggression that characterizes all human societies. Chapter 11 discusses how humans echo chimpanzee behavior in this regard, but have elaborated it far beyond chimpanzee style. Since proactive aggression is complementary to reactive aggression rather than its opposite, proactive, planful aggression can be positively selected even while reactive emotional aggression has been evolutionarily suppressed. Humans can therefore use overwhelming power to kill a selected opponent. This unique ability is transformative. It has led our societies to include hierarchical social relationships that are far more despotic than those found in other species. A familiar and important occurrence of proactive aggression is in war. So, in Chapter 12, I consider some of the ways in which the psychology of aggression influences warfare. Although contemporary war is much more institutionalized than most prehistoric intergroup violence, our tendencies for proactive and reactive aggression both play important roles, sometimes promoting and sometimes interfering with military goals. Chapter 13 assesses the paradox that virtue and violence are both so prominent in human life. The solution is not so simple or morally desirable as we might wish. Humans are neither all good nor all bad. We have evolved in both directions simultaneously. Both our tolerance and our violence are adaptive tendencies that have played vital roles in bringing us to our present state. The idea that human nature is at the same time both virtuous and wicked is challenging, since presumably we would all wish for simplicity. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. I must hold in balance," he continued, "the contradiction between the dead hand of the past and the high intentions of the future." I like Fitzgerald's thought. The moral contradictions of our ancestry should not prevent us from reaching a realistic assessment of who we are. When we do that, high hopes are still possible. 1. The Paradox. I started thinking about the biological roots of peacefulness several decades ago, in a remote part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Later, the Congo would suffer badly, but in 1980, when Elizabeth Ross and I began a 9-month honeymoon in the Ituri forest, all was quiet. We were there as part of a two-couple team. Our job was to document the lives of two societies living alongside each other, laissez farmers and FA foragers. Small villages of laissez farmers dotted the vast Ituri plain, some as far as 2 days' walk from their neighbors. FA pygmies occupied the same area. When the FA could find roots and fruits, they camped deep in the forest. In leaner times, they settled on the edge of a familiar village. FA women then worked in the laissez gardens in exchange for cassava, bananas, or rice. We lived in leaf-roofed, mud-walled huts in our own little clearing near a laissez village. We could not speak their first language, Kilese, but we knew enough Kingwana, a version of Swahili, to have cheerful conversations with them. The Ituri people knew little of the outside world. Their economy was based largely on barter. Such things as nuclear bombs, soda cans, and electricity were out.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?